Hi there, good to have your company as we look back on what 2023 told us about the royal family and what a year it has been, bookmarked by a pair of somewhat scandalous royal books and punctuated by a coronation 70 years in the making. Very pleased to say that joining us here in the studio are royal commentator Alistair Bruce and our royal correspondent Laura Bundock. Lovely to see you both, especially at this festive time of year. Before we get into the long grass of everything, I wonder, just really, really briefly, a reflection from both of you. How do you think those within and without the House of Windsor will characterise 2023 as a year in royals? Alistair?
It's been a success for the King because as head of state and for his household, they've settled down after the late Queen's death. We've gone through the coronation. We've seen the events in Scotland to mark the beginning of the reign, and he has had a number of state visits. And so for him, delivering what he needs at the centre of the Constitution, that is a success. Obviously, he's had to deal with quite a lot of noises off, and that will keep a great deal of interest and not necessarily the one that he wants in the public space.
Laura?
I think it's been a year of contrasts. I think we've had high public moments, and then I think we've had highly private moments, all exposed. So I think the column inches when it comes to the royal family have been considerable. Whether or not they're all about what the royal family wants us to be hearing, wants us to be talking about, is another matter. So from the coronation, these big public kind of displays, right through to the exposing comments we've had from certain members of the family.
Well, why don't we start there, shall we? Your working year started with that book that we were expecting, but we weren't expecting quite so soon.
No.
Pitched up in Spain. This is Spared, isn't it?
Yeah, so Harry's biography, so written for him. Look, we were expecting it on a certain date. It pops up on bookshelves in Madrid, and that's because of the way the Spanish celebrate, the festive season on a different date. They put it out on the shelves a day early because the bookshops were all going to be shut. So hence this huge rush. I think newsrooms across the world.
Were you on a budget airline stat to get over there?
Not personally,
right.
But we were waiting for someone else, basically. So arrives into the newsroom with this copy of the Spanish book, roughly translated. You get a huge gist of what was going on. Then, of course, the real version, the English version, I should say, comes out. And I think for everyone, and perhaps the only losers in this were Netflix, who were thinking, well, hang on a moment, we gave you this massive docuseries at the end of, the previous year. And yet we have a bombshell of a book, really. It felt like this huge spilling out from Prince Harry, basically. It was a score-setting, record-straightening memoir that did not hold back. And
Go on then, come on, give us the detail.
Well, it was intimate, wasn't it? I mean, just on the personal stuff, there was a lot in terms of what he'd personally kind of been through. Moments we didn't want to really have to relive with him. Let's not dwell too much on what happened to certain bits of his anatomy on a trip in colder climes.
On a podcast or indeed on television, yeah.
Or on perhaps certain things that might have taken place behind a pub in a field. All that very, very personal detail coming out. But then, of course, you had these huge, big bits of information about his relationship with his family. And he sort of, on the one hand, was, and remember all the interviews he gave afterwards, which were big as well, saying, look, I just wanted my truth out there. But this was a truth that he must have known was going to cause considerable, I don't know if pain is the right word, but it was very, very exposing for his family. And for me, looking back now, when I think about that book, it is on a level with the Andrew Morton Diana book in terms of this is someone right on the inside speaking right from the heart of the family about family members.
Just because of the way in which the curtain had been pulled back on the specifics of, let's not forget, I mean, at the core of it, a father-son relationship.
A father and son relationship that I don't think came out too badly in this book. The King perhaps portrayed as someone who tried his best but ultimately fell short of the emotional, expectation that his son, Prince Harry, had. But wasn't great when it came to the relationship with his brother, these warring brothers, like something everyone was talking about. A lot of the themes were Shakespearean, something of King Lear, basically, that the two brothers, the fisticuffs, and the stepmother as well. And then at the very heart of it, the sense of loss, that he was someone trying to avenge the death of his mother. and that this was this defining tragedy that continues, I think, to haunt him.
So what was the response then from the firm, from the royal family?
Nothing, literally nothing. And I think that has been the theme. I'm sure, and I'm saying this from my point of view, there will be eye rolling when something pops up about Prince Harry. Without a doubt, they'll be like, "What's coming next?" But I think they're used to it. I would say the family, will be bracing themselves. They won't have sat and watched it. I'm sure they won't have read the book for themselves, but the aides will have done. And probably, with their fingers kind of covering their eyes, I reckon, in terms of some of the stuff that came out in that book. It was pretty bruising, I think.
So whilst the royal family, of course, are cracking on and doing the tours and Charles at COP, and we'll be talking about that in just a second, of course, there were the court cases that were also going on in parallel with this as well.
Yeah, so the year started with the book and the interviews after that. And then we launched into what Harry once described his life's work, although in a recent book it's sort of we're being told perhaps it isn't his life's work, which is taking on the British tabloid press. And so we've had various bits and bobs come up. There are 3 court cases when it comes to taking on the press, involving 3 different newspaper groups. The most significant of those cases, which is the one that came to a proper kind of hearing, which happened just after the coronation, which we saw Harry give evidence in the witness box, was the case against the Mirror Group. And I mean, that was a huge moment to see a senior royal take the witness box and testify in the way he did. This was his big moment. It's not about the money for him. He wanted to have his moment saying all this.
And of course, his view of the tabloids, shaped, of course, by his mother and her death, but also shaped by their treatment of his wife, of Meghan. And which brings us on to the fact that in the background, of course, through the course of this year, have been those accusations of racism that were made initially in the Oprah Winfrey interview. And then, the tail end of the year, I mean, foreign publications of royal books, it's been going brilliantly this year. The Netherlands published the unauthorised version of Omid Scobie's book Endgame, and we had the names of the 2 people that Meghan believed were acting with unconscious bias.
And this was huge, because when you read the book, you're like, well, it's quite personal in parts, but have I learnt anything? I haven't. But when you then learnt what was in an initial draft that got sent to the Dutch publisher and ended up by mistake in the Dutch version, then you were like, okay, well, that was the bombshell that was meant to come out. And again, no response. Actually, interestingly, no response from Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, no response from the Sussexes either. And I think it's a little unfair in some ways, because a lot of people have been saying, well, why aren't the Sussexes saying something? Because this is their... But at the same time, we haven't got the Palaces saying something either. So there is a silence, and I'm sure the silence very intentionally aimed at hoping this goes away.
But does it, when we have those 2 names, which are Charles and Kate, in the public domain, without an official response from the palace as to the veracity of these claims? We understand that they're false and they're a fiction, but doesn't it just remain in the public consciousness?
It does. And that ongoing saga from the interview the Sussexes gave to Oprah Winfrey continues to cast a shadow. I mean, the King was on the world stage at COP. Remember, he wasn't allowed to go the year before, about to, give the keynote speech. And then you also have this popping up at the same time. And once again, that huge moment, he's being upstaged.
Alistair, one occasion on which the King was not upstaged would, of course, have been the coronation itself. I mean, you were there keeping eagle eyes on it. Your recollections of that day?
It worked, and although the weather wasn't great,
No, true.
an enormous amount of preparation had gone into it, and it was delivered much in line with what the King had hoped, which was to have a slightly less dramatic one than his late mother, Elizabeth II.
It was still pretty
It was still
dramatic, to be fair.
very glamorous, and all the symbols came out of the Tower of London, and they were invested upon the new King through a religious service, which perhaps many people found extraordinary to watch.
Well, he did once want to be described as the defender of faiths, didn't he?
I think in the way that he operates, he always seeks to understand and encompass other people's faiths because he cares very much about his own, and he's also fascinated by those who have none at all, and tries to pursue that as an interest as well. But the title is Defender of the Faith, and with that and much else he was invested at Westminster Abbey. And I feel that, it is surprising that it was received, watched and absorbed by the United Kingdom, which is a very post-deferential country, with almost entire relaxed attitudes. And although, quite rightly, there were plenty of people who feel very differently about that, who came out and expressed their opinion. That's what life's all about.
What then, in your mind, is the function of a coronation and the function of this coronation? Of course, one of the people that was very prominent was Camilla.
That's true. I mean, the function of a coronation is constitutionally a like to have rather than a must have. The process of accession is vital to the constitution, but it is traditional that monarchs are crowned. And that's because once upon a time all monarchs were crowned, and that we are the last of the nations in the world that still have a Christian anointing as part of our coronation, and that the crown is actually put on the head. But to have Camilla there too, and there'd be much discussion about whether she would take on the title as queen, and that was dealt with by the late queen. And to see her crowned and anointed beside him was itself significant, because she has passed through a very long journey coming to that point. And as king and queen, they have settled into their life this year. And again, I think it's been a very successful year for them both in terms of the way they have delivered against what is expected.
Obviously, I know that Charles is very, very keen on the agricultural, so you'll excuse the pun. But has he been able to plough his own furrow this year? Has he been able to set his own course in a way in which last year might have felt slightly inappropriate?
Yes, he's given some fairly strong views on behalf of government, both going to the COP and also when he made comments after the atrocity in Israel. And, both those are moments that perhaps were surprising, because it is an evolution. It's not a change, but it is an evolution in that the way the monarch speaks must always be with the authority and permission of the government of the day. But the government of the day chose to take the king slightly further than I think any government would ever have tried to take Elizabeth II.
Have we now, though, moved away from the idea of Charles as a placeholder monarch, as a caretaker monarch? I understand that a lot of the things that will be happening during his reign are about what comes next and who is a working royal and who is not, and the structure and the funding and all the rest of it. But won't he always, to an extent, have that kind of that title hanging over him?
Well, I feel that the king is in something of a hurry. I think he has landed in this reign with a determination to try and achieve quite a lot. Obviously, he's now at the age that he holds, and he's not going to last as long as sovereign as the late Queen did. But I think what's great is that he is a king who, unlike our previous monarch, absolutely adores the arts, cares about culture, is finding his own way with the Commonwealth. And I think that collectively we're seeing an enormous amount of activity in Buckingham Palace. I mean, they have reception after reception, and I'm sure Laura would agree. They're not slowing down, the King and Queen. They're absolutely at full pace.
Laura?
Look, clearly, constitutionally, his wings have been clipped in some ways, but I do think, I've spoken to people really close to him when it comes to the environment, especially that issue where he spoke out for so many years and has finally perhaps been appreciated as someone who was ahead of the game when it came to caring about the climate crisis. I feel that when Biden came to visit in the summer, he at the same time managed to convene this huge big climate forum involving, so there are little ways around the edges. But I do think the big problem for him and his challenge this year has been he needs to prioritise, because he knows he won't have as long as the late Queen, and he really needs to think about what can he do to make a difference, what is it he wants to do. And we saw on his birthday the launch of the Coronation Food Project that's matching sort of food poverty, all that kind of thing, and maybe that's where he's going. But it feels a bit, he works quickly, but a lot of it is business as usual type things. When he wants to make a difference, that's perhaps where we quite haven't seen where he's heading.
Alistair, just on the amount that we are seeing Kate and William these days, particularly at those diplomatic events. They are providing an awful lot of heavy-duty assistance to the King and Queen at the moment, aren't they?
Well, because they should, and that is the thing that they're there to do. And I think supporting the king in his constitutional role as head of state is precisely what members of the royal family are there to provide. And I think for the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales, they have stepped up. Interestingly, I wait to see the speed with which the king's household has moved forward with its brand, and yet the Prince of Wales is still using a symbol that he carried when he was Duke of Cambridge. You'd expect him to have the 3 feathers, and all that. It just simply hasn't yet happened. So I'm waiting to see when that does. But, they are busy playing their part at the side of the king. And I think we'll see more of them doing that, despite the fact they have a young family and want to make sure they keep very much parenting there.
Alistair was kind of walking us through some of those moments in history that we had this year, Laura. But there was also, I suppose, there was, as Alistair himself mentioned, a backdrop of protests, even on the day of the coronation itself, which perhaps did make things feel slightly different to the reign of his mother.
Yes, you would never have seen. I mean, we saw some egg throwing. That wasn't the Republicans, but you wouldn't have seen that for the late Queen. You wouldn't have seen placards and megaphones and sort of shouting. And even the protesters themselves will admit they see this change with a new monarch as a moment for them, and they believe that what they're doing, what they believe in, it is gathering momentum. That this is a kind of, they call it a watershed moment for republicanism.
I mean, do you think that there has actually been a growth in republicanism, or has that group Republic, who have been very, very prominent over the past year and a half, that they have perhaps commanded headlines that the Republican movement might not get?
Look, when it comes to Republic as a movement itself, their membership has...
Sorry, I should explain. They're the pressure group that were outside the coronation.
With the Not My King, the yellow banners. So, and I think perhaps mistakenly, a lot of them were taken away from the coronation protest. So they were allowed to protest. They were removed from that, which caused the wrong sort of headlines. Because I think, ask any member of the royal family, they would accept people should be allowed to express those views. The king would have been expecting it. He would have been told about it. He would have known where they were going to be. And he would have not looked that way, not kind of waved at them, all that kind of stuff. But I do feel that you have to perhaps separate the Republican movement as Republic as a group, and then perhaps the apathy side of it. And I think for me, what I've noticed, and without a doubt, Republic are more out and about, more vocal, more organised, and have bigger resources now to hold these protests. But I think it is the growing apathy, particularly among younger generations, which is the problem for the royal family, and those who perhaps just don't care. But it's not that they want to abolish the monarchy, but they're just not that bothered anymore.
But I think it's an attribute of relevance in this time. Almost every issue has people who are violently for and violently against. And I think that if there wasn't an issue of those who feel very much against monarchy, I think that monarchy itself would not thrive. It is the nature of the environment we're in. And I think in 2024, it appears we're in a period of great anger in the world. And that anger is spawned by many things. And I think however good or kind or whatever you might seek to be, you'll upset someone. And I think it's healthy that in a constitution like ours, people can express it. And I agree with you, Laura. I think it was a great sadness that during the coronation in 2023, people were prevented or made uncomfortable for expressing what they're entitled to express.
Well, I suppose then, and this is a question to both of you, that what happens as regards this Republican movement, or indeed the apathy, depends an awful lot on what Charles, Camilla, William, Kate do next. So what do they do next? Alistair, do you think?
Well, I'm quite dull on this. I always think that the role of the head of state is to carry on delivering that deep keel in the sea of time and let the political process, which we know will become quite heated during a general election year, let that move on. And I would imagine that interest in whether we are or are not a monarchy might come into the political debate as part of the process. But at the same time, I think that the King's best role is to just get on with it, rather like the late Queen did, and deliver that continuity. But he will at the same time try and advance many things that he's interested in. Whereas the Prince of Wales has taken on from his father that sense that he is now in a position of influence and freedom. And I expect he will advance many of the things he cares about. I'm very interested, because I spend so much of my time in Edinburgh, that he's expressed such interest in homelessness. And Edinburgh has perhaps the most dramatic problem with homelessness and the difficulties that that brings. And I expect to see, as we call him in Scotland, the Duke of Rothesay up with us quite a lot.
The Duke of Rothesay. I was going to sneak in a reference myself. Laura, just a final thought then from you on 2024, what needs to be done and what you suspect will be done.
Well, if we look at the Prince and Princess of Wales, because I think they're interesting, they're the ones that make the front pages, perhaps more than the King and Queen. They've both got their individual pursuits now. They're stepping up into the role of Prince and Princess of Wales as opposed to where they were before. They're wanting to make a difference. They're wanting to make an impact. It's interesting because Kate recently cut a ribbon at something. We don't see that anymore. That's not what they want to be doing. It's whether or not it cuts through enough. Because they are, in their early 40s, the youngest working senior royals. They are the youngest. You have to go up to your late 50s to get the next youngest.
Are you suggesting the early 40s isn't young anymore? God.
What I'm saying is that if you have a population that is questioning you a bit more and feels apathetic towards you, you need to be finding ways to engage with them. And so they are the future. And maybe we see a tour with them and their 3 children on tour to try and do that. I would not be at all surprised.
Laura, Alistair, lovely to see you. All the very best for 2024 when it comes, when we will no doubt be talking again. And I'm afraid that is your lot. For more on this year in the House of Windsor, all you've got to do is head to where you find your podcasts, search for the Sky News Daily, and you'll find plenty from both Laura and Alistair. We'll see you soon.